Good afternoon, everybody. We have quite a packed house today. I am very excited to say that we're our largest conference in about 5 years. So thank you all very much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. For those of you that don't know me or didn't hear me talk too much this morning, my name is Maria Thacker. I'm President and CEO of Georgia Bio. Really hope the conference is going well for you and you're finding it meaningful and valuable. I am not talking much this session. I'm really here just to get y'all to simmer down, enjoy your lunch, and invite up our wonderful and partner and our sponsor for the luncheon today, Bio. As many of y'all know, we're the affiliate of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization out of DC, and we really appreciate them sponsoring today's keynote. So with that, I'm going to introduce Bob Dirth, who's with Bio's Biobusiness Solutions program, which if you are an industry partner and member and not taking advantage of it, you should be, because I can be saving you lots of money. So Bob will go ahead and talk about that. Bob.
Thank you, Maria. First of all, I hope I don't have any lettuce in my teeth after starting to eat the salad. Who are we? We are the world's largest trade association dedicated to the biotechnology industry and the organizations within that industry. Our goal is we advocate for issues that impact the industry, and much of that is done in Washington, D.C., and along with the state houses across the country. In addition, each year we host the annual Bio Convention. This coming year, in 2020, that event will be in San Diego in June, and it's the largest meeting of its type in the world. There will be approximately 18,000 attendees, so our hope is that Georgia will once again be well represented at that meeting. Okay. Bio also offers a program that all Georgia Bio members should be taking advantage of, and that's the Bio Business Solutions Cost Savings Program. This is the largest cost savings program focused on the life science industry. For pre-revenue companies, it's all about capital preservation, and for those of you that are commercial companies now, it's about operational expense reduction. On average, customers save $109,000 per year by partaking in this program. So I'd like to pause for a second and talk a little bit about value. When I was 5 years old, my grandfather taught me a lot about value, and the way he did it is we had a bakery around the corner from us, and on Tuesdays we'd go to the bakery and he would take me there, and they had a concept that was called the baker's dozen. I don't know if it still exists anymore, but the baker's dozen was where you would pay for 12 pastries and you would get 13. So my grandfather said to me, this is a great example of getting value, and this is why we walked the 2 extra blocks to this bakery as opposed to another one that was closer to our house. So I think what's important here is that this program brings value and it delivers value to the members of Georgia Bio, no matter where you are in the life cycle of your operation, from proof of concept through go-to-market. Our partners in the program are listed here. Many of them are in attendance and have tables and booths that you can meet with them. I urge you to meet with me afterwards and let's talk about the program, okay? Georgia Bio members saved over $2 million in 2018, and some examples of the savings are featured here on what you can receive through the program and what aspect of your business it impacts. how is this done? How does it work? It's really all about buying power. Bio works with over 40 state affiliates, like Georgia Bio, and we have volume. There's almost 600 million in spend on this program annually. And because of that volume, it gives us the power to negotiate on your behalf and get better price points. If you wonder how the program works, we have contracts. They're pre-negotiated. Contract terms are reviewed by the BIO's legal team. We do our due diligence to make sure that we're offering programs that are of value to our members across the country. The proof is in the pudding, and this slide just shows you that over the last 20 years, we've grown from approximately 250 participating companies up to close to 4,200. And in terms of the spend, it's gone from 14 million up to close to 600 million. And as you can see, Georgia Bio members purchased close to $6 million in product last year, and they saved over $2 million on that spend. So it's quite significant. And at this time, I think the most important thing I can say to you now is if you're not taking advantage of this, you're missing an opportunity to save, and please reach out to me, Maria, Christina, the entire team, and we can help you out. So now it's my opportunity to introduce to the stage Georgia Bio Innovation Summit Chair, Scott Rizzo. Thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I can't believe it's halfway over already. What a bummer, huh? I'm going to talk real quickly about a little bit about our company, Recro Gainesville, and then I have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker. But before I do that, I want to tell you a quick story. About 9 months ago, Maria came up to me and said, "Hey, Scott, would you mind being, the summit chair this year?" And I thought, what a great opportunity. I'll get to meet a whole bunch of new folks, a lot of folks that would have mutual interest, and there's obviously a business opportunity to do it as well. And then I saw how much work there was, and I thought, what have I done? And literally the next day, Maria and her team took all that away. And I got to tell you, being the chair, this is going to be the easiest job because of all the incredible work that Maria and Christina and the rest of the folks at Georgia Bio have done to put this on. So if you could join me in just giving them a quick round of applause. Thank you. So a little bit about Recro Gainesville. You can probably tell from my accent I'm not originally from Georgia. I'm a Jersey transplant, back in that big pharma hub up in New Jersey. And when I took the job at Recro, I told my neighbors when they asked me, what do you do? I said, I make drugs. And it's so great. A guy with the last name Rizzo coming from New Jersey making drugs. Here goes the property values. And I got to meet the people in our company, and we don't make drugs. That's only part of what we do. We help improve people's lives, as well as everybody else in this room. And I'm very proud of the industry that I am and all of us are involved with. I had an old boss that, I'm embarrassed to say, it's almost 30 years ago now. He said, we don't make wrenches. Now, we make medicine. This will improve the lives of many people. So take what you do very seriously, and I know we all do. Recro Gainesville is a company I'm very proud of. We're a contract manufacturer. We do development work as well. We're known for solid oral dose formulation capabilities. We could take a product or your product from literally the bench and idea, help you develop it and take you all the way through to commercialization. We have some very small 2-minute molecule companies all the way up to the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world that work with us in sleepy little Gainesville, Georgia. So I'm very happy and honored to be able to present to you today's keynote. So I'd like to have Mark Boulin come up on the stage now, Mark. So Mark is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Health Council. He's been a leading voice for greater patient involvement at every stage of the healthcare continuum, starting with the development of new drugs to regulatory oversight of healthcare delivery to shared decision-making at the point of care. Under his leadership, the National Health Council has convened a broad range of stakeholders to create and effectively implement pragmatic strategies and public policy that address diverse issues, such as enhancing patient engagement, advancing development of new treatments, and developing a better health delivery system to meet the needs of people with chronic diseases. Mark has a long history of board and committee service. Currently, he serves as a member of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, Patient Engagement Advisory Panel, Fast Cures Benefit Risk Advisory Council, and the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, MDIC, Patient-Centered Benefit Risk Steering Committee. Got a lot of committees, Mark. Where are you? Mark has been actively involved in patient advocacy, organization management, health advocacy, and both federal and state policy throughout his career. He is a founding member of the International Patient-Focused Medicine Development Consortium and has served on the governing board of the International Alliance of Patients Organizations as a member and treasurer. He is also a former member of the Partnership to Fight Chronic Diseases Board of Directors, the Humana Cares Clinical Advisory Board, and eHealth Initiative Leadership Council, Community Health Charities Board of Directors, Healthcare Systems Research Collaboration, North American Advisory Board to the Drug Information Association. So please join me in a round warm of applause for Mark Boulin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I know the lights are down low. You're just having a heavy dinner. You're in the middle of your meeting. We're going to bring out wine in a few minutes, so don't worry. You know, well, first of all, I need to apologize to Scott. I should have sent him the short bio, so clearly got the strings confused on that. But I really appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The work you guys do means a lot to people with chronic conditions. And I wanted to explain a little bit about my journey and the collective work of the patient advocacy community and how it interplays with what's happening in the health environment currently. And I want to start by saying that I grew up in a very rural part of the country, up in northern Maine. Is there anybody in the audience from Maine? Any arms? We don't get out very much. No, I grew up in a place where most people didn't have running water or electricity. We actually brought the water in from the lake near the house. And it was a beautiful place to grow up, but there was absolutely nothing going on. And I was fortunate. When I was 13, I actually won a scholarship and started living abroad. Spent a long time in Europe and in Asia studying. I have a British law degree. Actually was offered a job at the European Communities. And I was really excited about it. This was way back in the day, long before we had a euro, and even before the UK was even in the Union, much less thinking about getting out of the Union. But over a 4-month period in time, every member of my family was diagnosed with one or more chronic conditions. And they ranged from heart disease, cancer, neurologic, autoimmune, rare, and HIV. So I decided to change course. I came back, I settled in Boston, I practiced civil rights law, and I was close to where my family was so I could help them navigate the health system. And I have to tell you, I was completely dismayed at how hard it was for my family and for myself. I became incredibly well connected, but despite those connections, I watched as one member died after the other. And they died for 2 reasons. Either there were no effective treatments for their condition, or there were highly effective treatments, but the system couldn't get them to them in the right time. Incredibly frustrating. And I began volunteering with the patient community, and over time, my law firm lent me to one for a year. And I've been doing this for about 25 years. And I'm passionate about driving innovation to get better treatments for people with chronic conditions, and about ensuring that we have meaningful, affordable access to high-valued care. And it led me to working with the National Health Council, which was created by patient organizations for patient organizations 99 years ago. We only focus on systemic issues. Our membership includes all the groups that you would know, like the American Cancer Society, American Heart Association. But it also includes patient groups from lesser known, less prevalent, even ultra-rare conditions. They represent the complete spectrum of the patient advocacy community. Because we work on systemic issues, the CEOs of the patient groups decided we should bring all stakeholders into membership so that we can better impact the system to get outcomes that are important to people with chronic conditions. And as a result, we have the biopharmaceutical, device, diagnostic, payer, provider, researcher, and family caregiving communities all represented in the organization. And it's allowed us to understand at a very deep level systemic, complex problems and develop solutions. We were able to craft more than 36 provisions that found its way into the Affordable Care Act, more than 24 provisions that created the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI. We've been able to draft sections that have been inserted in user fee agreement 4, 5, 6, and we've already begun to draft sections for 7. Multiple sections in 21st Century Cures Act. We believe that collaboration and a multi-stakeholder approach is the best way to solve some of the complex problems for people with chronic conditions. But I have to tell you, doing this for 25 years, over the course of the last several years, there's been a dramatic change in how the patient community feels in this environment. Starting about 3 years ago, I began doing listening sessions with the CEOs of the patient groups and their constituents, and I've done more than 50 of them. And every single group is telling me that affordability is their #1 concern. And I think that's really important. Even conditions representing deadly diseases like ALS are now saying, I can't get basic coverage for my health. These are groups that would have chained themselves to the fence to get a treatment for their condition. But the environment has shifted so much that people are primarily concerned about affordability. And that creates a real dynamic, especially for an organization that is really focused on driving innovation and access. When you start to think about the challenges that these groups are facing, we're in a place where if you are not of upper middle class and you are working, you are likely spending 22% of your annual income on health in the first month or second month of the year. So think about that. How many of you in the room could afford to spend 22% of your annual income at the end of January or beginning of February to get the health care that you need? Many of the people we represent, whether they be in Medicaid, Medicare, or in private markets, are simply going without access to the care that they need. And they're talking to their members of Congress. They're talking to people in the administration. And you're seeing this groundswell of focus on healthcare costs, in particular drug pricing. Created a situation where we in the patient community are feeling overwhelmed. Everybody is saying they've got the policy for the patient, but when you delve deeper into the policy, they're often a mixed bag. And in many cases, they're not driving the savings to the patient. We agree that we have to address healthcare costs. We've been a leader in Washington on that issue. We have to do it sensibly. But I can tell you when we're being inundated with one new proposal after another, you feel overwhelmed. You know, in my 25 years as a patient advocate, I can tell you that there are two kinds of people. You have big picture thinkers, and you have detailed-oriented thinkers. And I find the mix very interesting. How many people in the room are big picture thinkers? And how many of you are detailed-oriented thinkers? So I'm seeing about a 50-50 split. And it's interesting because research suggests that only about 20% of the population are big picture thinkers and 80% are detailed-oriented. So either we have an overrepresentation of big picture thinkers, or a bunch of you are big fat liars. It's research. You guys are all data people, right? So I want to read to you some language that comes from the British Journal of Psychology. And it's what big picture thinkers think about detailed-oriented thinkers. So those of you who are detailed-oriented, can you put your hand up? Okay, according to the British Journal of Psychology, big picture thinkers think detailed-oriented thinkers are micromanagers, unable to delegate, and highly ineffective. It's not me. It's the British Journal of Psychology. Now, for you detailed-oriented people who are now feeling like the big picture thinkers are ganging up on you, you think, again, British Journal of Psychology, that big picture thinkers are scattered, wildly speculative, and extremely eccentric. Kind of fits me. I'm okay with it. I share this because when we're overwhelmed, when we're in a place of chaos, we have to come together. Big picture thinkers work best when they've got detailed-oriented people along their sides, and sometimes we can help you see where we're going. And we're all under stress, and collectively we need to step up and lead, because I'm not happy with where we are in the state of health. I'm not happy with the direction we are going. And in the words of one of America's most prolific scientific philosophers, we have to get off the Yellow Brick Road, guys. We don't know where we're going, and we're just simply reacting. We're going to have major problems. And when I sit back and I look at where we are in health and what's going on in Washington in the state of policy and where we're going to be in 5 years, we're not thinking about where we're going. And we've got to get together and think about where it is we need to be and how we accelerate that. And I'd like to walk you through a couple of challenges that are moving the environment very quickly. First is, in the last 2 decades, there's been an absolute explosion of people with chronic diseases. CDC now says 60% of Americans have one or more chronic conditions. 30% of our children have one or more chronic conditions. And yet we're largely invisible. Take a moment and look to the person to your right. Now look to the person to your left. Which one's more attractive? Don't answer that. Let's get. You know, I'm standing here, and can any of you tell that I've been diagnosed with cancer 3 times? Second time was terminal. I had 9 months. That was 15 years ago. 7 months ago, I was diagnosed with Crohn's and colitis. I lost 27 pounds in 4 weeks. I became so lightheaded I would faint, get tunnel vision. My point being, we think people who have chronic conditions have no hair because of chemotherapy. They're in a hospital somewhere. The reality, we are integrated into society. One of the people sitting next to you probably has a chronic condition. We are invisible. And as a result, we forget. And yet we are driving costs. And you all know the numbers. 30% of the people I represent drive 80 to 90% of all healthcare costs. 5% of the people I represent drive 50% of the costs. And yet we have not taken the time to renovate our health ecosystem to think about how we deliver care in the most effective way possible. As a patient advocate, we have wanted cures. In fact, many of the organizations in my membership have in their mission statement a cure for their disease. And you guys are finally delivering. When you look at the cell and gene-based therapies you guys are working on, we have hundreds in the pipeline. The first couple have now been approved. These may actually be durable cures. But think of the pressure that is putting on our system. Explosion of people with chronic conditions driving up costs, new curative therapies coming into a system that's based on a calendar year. For the first time, we may put enough pressure to start to think of ways to get beyond this short-termism in health. What is this going to do for your outcomes-based contracts? What does this do to value assessment? What is going to happen to how we finance this? You know, if you're in Medicaid, your length of time in a plan can be less than a year. In the individual market, about 14 to 16 months. If you're the payer, why would you pay $2.5 million for a cure for somebody who's going to be in another plan in a year? But in Massachusetts, the plans are coming together and they're figuring out how they can reinsure that cost over a period of time. System is changing. There's tremendous pressures being brought to bear. How many of you in the room are registered to vote? Great. So we have a highly civic organization. I love that. Did you know that there are more than 300 companies in the United States with more than 5,000 data points on you? Kind of creepy. They know what you buy for food. They know if you have a gym membership. They know if you use that gym membership. You know, Aetna is a member of the National Health Council. In fact, their chief medical officer served on our board of directors. And they were acquired recently. In fact, how many of you have an extra care card from CVS? A few people. So you know when you go in and you pay for something, you get this ticker tape comes up. It's kind of addictive. You start to want to beat the system. You know, about a year ago, I went in with all the coupons, and I bought $230 worth of stuff. Cost me $33. Pretty good, huh? I thought you guys would be impressed with that. Now, CVS has all that data on what I buy. I would say you have to question some of that data because I have enough shampoo for the next 7 years. But I still beat the system. And you know, there's a reason why we're so addicted to our phones. You watch people crossing the street into traffic, looking at their text messages. And the reason is they've used behavioral science to hook us. And CVS is doing the same thing. And a lot of people thought CVS acquired Aetna because they wanted to drive their consumer business in their stores. And yeah, that's part of it. But the primary reason CVS acquired Aetna is because they want to integrate their consumer data with Aetna's claims data. And they're going to use those insights to drive behaviors to get better health outcomes at lower cost. Data is finally turning into insights that we can actually use. And collectively, they're driving change. And over the next several years, we have an opportunity to accelerate more personalized health, to renovate the current health system that is trying to move to population, but actually needs to move to the person. Huge opportunities. And I love this slide because when I show it to industry, what they see is personalized medicine, which is important. When I show it to the plans, they see an opportunity to use the social determinants of health and data around that to drive better outcomes at lower cost. But when I show that to patients, they see an opportunity to use health to get the outcome that matches what's important to them. At the end of the day, personalized health is at the intersection of the determinants of health and your desired outcome. Critically important, it's the combination. And all too often we forget about the desired outcomes. And we do that at our risk. Now, the health determinants include biology, and I know you're focused in on personalizing your medicines, but do not forget about the social, environmental, and economic determinants, and certainly don't forget about the outcomes people want. And don't make assumptions that you know. We can tee up the video. Most people understand that the three outcomes are survival, feel, function. But the interrelationship between those three, if you can tee the video, please, is critically important. Don't assume it's just survival. We all live for a reason, every single one of us. Doesn't matter if you have a chronic condition or not. Pretty powerful stuff, huh? You know, you make extraordinary medicines, devices, diagnostics, but you don't make them so people can go to the doctor's office. You don't make them so people can go into hospitals. You're making them because it is a tool that helps people to live their best life possible. I think it's incredibly important that we don't lose sight of that. Health has become big business, and that can drive innovation. But at the end of the day, we need to focus in on the outcomes that matter, and we need to enable people to live their dreams, not our dreams. It's not always about survival. With that, I look forward to our next session, and I thank you for having me, and I thank you for spending a little bit of time. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Sheila Burke, Strategic Advisor and Chair for the Government Relations and Public Policy Group of Baker Donelson. Moderating this session will be Crystal Edmondson, Broadcast Editor for the Atlanta Business Chronicle.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and you all are really engaged. Thank you, Mark, for teeing up this discussion. It's a pleasure to be with you all today, really to talk about putting the patient first, and you brought up some very important points, Mark, in your talk, and I really want to start. We'll cover a lot of ground in our time this afternoon, but I want to really start with a point that you left off with, Mark, and that is focusing on the outcomes that matter. And to me, when I hear that, everybody has, I'm sure, in their mind, their goals, their aims, et cetera. Can you just talk a little bit more about how do we do that? How does the industry do that?
Well, I'm excited to say that the industry has evolved a lot in terms of engaging patients in drug development, and many of you have been very involved in that. Certainly UCB, we heard from earlier, but many of the organizations are highly involved in engaging patients, and it's something that the National Health Council has driven for about 15 years. It started with the creation of PCORI and then the Patient-Focused Drug Development Program at FDA, where now we're seeing organizations and companies really reorient to understand at the very front end of ideation, I have a potential molecule, we think it might do this. Does it matter? Historically, we've gone to surrogates and we've asked surrogates what they think. And one of the things I've learned is I've rarely met somebody in the health ecosystem that isn't super well intended. But being super well intended does not mean that you understand the outcomes that matter. I'll give you a very specific example. Are people familiar with Duchenne's? I see a few people shaking their heads. Horrible disease that is 100% deadly, strikes usually boys at 3 or 4, and they start to regress in their development. It attacks their nervous system, their muscular system. Over time, they lose the ability to walk, talk, feed themselves, even breathe. The patient groups in that community had mapped that disease and de-risked it, and a lot of companies went into developing treatments. And you actually at one point had 12 companies focused in on extending life by 6 months. But when you brought the kids together and the families together and said, what is important to you? Kids said, you know what? At the last 6 months, I'm worried that I am going to choke to death in my saliva when I'm trying to sleep and be unable to call out for help. 6 more months of living like that, I don't want it. Survival is not the end point here, guys. What they said was, give me the strength to grab my sleeve with my teeth throw my hand on the table, and type out a message to my buddy. 6 more months of functionality, I'll take it. Point being, we often focus on the wrong outcomes. We're not collecting the right clinical data. And at the back end, the payers are starting to realize that the old myth that patients want access to everything is wrong. We want access that allows us to live our lives. And that doesn't mean everything. And in fact, many of us are grossly overtreated. It really is an opportunity to focus. And the payers are realizing that, again, 30% of us driving 80% of your cost, we actually help them achieve their dreams. It's more expensive to deliver that kind of care, but boy, can it save me a lot of money in missed emergency room visits and other treatment. So there's an opportunity where the ecosystem is moving. And I think we have to look at ways of accelerating it and doing it correctly.
Thank you. And Sheila, I want to bring you into the conversation here, given your background and all that you've done. Talk a little bit about, we're going to broaden this a little bit, talk a little bit about your perception of the top discussions when it comes to healthcare going on in Washington. What are some of the top issues that lawmakers and policymakers are talking about?
Thank you, and my thanks as well for the opportunity to be here. I had one of my children went to Emory, so I spent a fair amount of time in Atlanta, but she, thank God, graduated, so I don't spend so much time here anymore, but it's a treat to be back. I want to build on, in part, what Mark has pointed out in an extraordinary way. A lot of what Mark has talked about in terms of cost certainly has driven a lot of the agenda. One need only look at the newspaper today, in fact, the New York Times, a huge story about the amount of money that we spend that's considered waste and the contributors to that over time. Issues with respect to access, issues with respect to how one creates value. If you look at what's driving the current agenda, it is about drug prices, for sure. It's about surprise medical bills. It is out-of-pocket costs. It's lack of access to coverage and what that coverage costs. There are unique questions around certain diseases, for sure, that we've certainly talked about. But the issue is really what the families are facing in terms of costs and access to care. The point made about the presence of chronic illness and the extraordinary pressure that puts on a family, and whether or not, in fact, we are adequately prepared to deal with that. Issues around choice. What is it that people choose to do? And I think that's led to a conversation about what our payment systems do, how we incentivize certain kinds of behavior, how we adjust essentially for people's choices, where the fee-for-service system in place today tends to incentivize people to do more to get more. And so a great desire to rethink about the way we finance care in this country, if there are a way to essentially change that system in order to result in fewer costs, but still quality care. And then fundamentally, there's a question about what in fact is quality and what is it that we mean by value. And a great deal of discussion about how one measures that and whether in fact we can find a way to achieve the outcomes that we seek and reduce the costs. We are the most expensive system in the entire world in terms of industrialized countries, but our results are far less in terms of outcomes. So it's a question of how does one achieve what Mark seeks, and how does one do it in a way that reduces costs but still makes those sources available.
How close are we to getting to a value-based system and making those assessments?
Well, interestingly, in this piece that's in the Times today, it's an interesting discussion about that question. And in fact, we are not as close as one would hope for a host of reasons, not the least of which is defining what we mean by value. We look at other European systems and others that use quality of life. That's not been something that as a country we've chosen to do. Is value essentially the cost issue, something that's less costly? Is value length of life? Is value quality of life? And we've found that there are limited instances where we've been able to clearly define value and tie a reimbursement structure to that, but we are not nearly as far along as we would like to be. And part of it is the measurement issue that Mark raises and agreeing upon what we think, in fact, outcomes ought to be.
Wow. And, when you think about these discussions and are we having, I guess, the right discussions, or obviously there are multiple discussions going on when you think about bipartisanship in Congress and healthcare. There's this, broad umbrella of healthcare plans, but obviously we're getting into more detailed discussions. Are we talking about the right things in terms of
Well,
our
we're
Congress?
certainly talking about we're talking about the things that are driving a lot of the public discussion, and those relate to cost. And in terms of patients' concerns, there was a review done in the spring of this year that sort of raised the question about what is it that people care about. And you can imagine going into an election cycle, people are highly attuned to what it is that the public defines as being their problem. Healthcare costs is at the top of that agenda. But then you look at what it is they define as being the causative factors. And at the top of it, it's the cost of drugs. Second to that is the cost that physicians charge. After that is the cost of the insurance premium. I mean, there are a whole host of reasons that the public identifies cost as a problem. And so the discussions have been around solving the problems that are on the front page of your local newspaper. How do we avoid surprise bills? How do we avoid out-of-pocket costs? And that's where most of the attention has been. There's also been attention, and Mark can certainly speak about this, in terms of our investments in research. And what do we know in terms of the opportunities to address some of these issues? The insurance company that isn't going to benefit from the fact that the investment now will return in terms of reduction of services because somebody's moving between plans. So there is a lot of conversation around how we incentivize and make available to patients information that allow them to make better choices. How do we create the transparency that will allow decisions to be made by providers, by patients, and by others? And I think those conversations are certainly driving a lot of the public agenda currently.
Yeah. Before we get away from the value, the issue of value, Mark, can you talk a little bit about how NHC is determining and helping to shape the way that value is determined?
First and foremost, in every country that assesses value, there's very limited, if any, input from the patient. It's largely surrogate assumption about what the patient wants. And I gave you the example of Duchenne's. Those assumptions are almost always not aligned with people living with that chronic condition. And so we have to change that paradigm. And we are spearheading a great deal of work on value assessment. And I'll make a call. We lobby. And so does Bio, and so do many of your companies. When you look at PCORI, it's up for reauthorization. Collectively, we said it could not do cost-effectiveness research. And the patient community was right there. We were right there with you on that. However, it was supposed or authorized to determine or generate evidence about value. And we have nearly a decade of experience with them where they've done a great job of being patient-centered, of engaging patients, and getting at the issues that matter. We ought to direct it to more specifically develop the evidence that can be used in cost effectiveness. And we ought to direct it to bring together the stakeholders and figure out a uniquely American methodology, not based on the quality. We believe the quality discriminates against us because we're automatically at a disadvantage if you have a chronic condition. But let's develop a methodology that is multi-stakeholder driven, that has a shared determination of what is value. Because right now, all the bills that are being directed at you are discriminating against high and low value equally. That makes no sense. I don't mind if we discriminate against your low value products. I really don't. And it's more complicated because you can have a high value product for a certain kind of person with a disease in a set of circumstances, but it might be extraordinarily low value for somebody else. And that means we need to take away some policies to figure out how we allow you to more nuanced set of pricing directives around your products. But we can get there. It's not going to be easy, but we need to move in that direction. We can't simply say everything is too expensive.
Let me, if I may, build on Mark's comments. The history of PCORI is actually an interesting one. When PCORI was first created as part of the ACA, there was an enormous amount of concern on the part of some that would essentially get into the business of making decisions that ought to be made by providers, between the provider and the patient. A great deal of concern that, in fact, cost would become the driving factor and the decisions of coverage would be linked to that issue. And so the prohibition in terms of cost was in part because of the fear that cost would become the dominant issue and that essentially a decision would be made solely on the basis of whether it was going to be costly or not. Interestingly enough, PCORI, since that period of time, has really, I think, seen a resurgence of interest on the part of both sides, Republicans and Democrats, and the reauthorization that Mark notes, in fact, is likely to be bipartisan, and the issue is around how long, whether it's a 3-year extension or a 7-year extension, and it'll all be about cost. That is the cost of continuing the program. But the fundamental question, which is the value of comparative research, very different than the NIH's purpose, or from essentially the FDA's purpose. In this case, it really is designed to look at the comparative effectiveness of certain kinds of behaviors. But again, I think there will always be that cautionary note that those decisions, if tied to coverage, become an issue. And so I think as we go forward with PCORI, the value of the comparative research, absolutely. But continuing concerns that it not be used to essentially provide barriers to care. There was a period of time when the issue of back surgery, early on in PCORI's history, that raised all sorts of hell. And the members essentially blew back and said, you know, enough. And we went through a number of years where essentially there was an attempt to get rid of PCORI, in part because of that reason, or to further constrain them. And so I think that balancing act, which is how do we use the information, what is it used for in terms of the decision-making process, and how we provide transparency and information that allows people to make the right decision, but careful not to essentially have it be a barrier to people accessing care.
How long should PCORI be funded for, in your opinion?
You know, it's going to be, at the end of the day, a question of the budget. Yeah. There's a 3-year authorization consideration, there's a 7-year reauthorization, and it's going to depend in part on what the budget number is. I think the budget this year is around 600. Yeah, so I think it'll be a question of what the federal budget does. We're in the middle of not having an appropriations process, so how we end up solving that question. But it's really about that, and thank heavens we're beyond the, you know, they're going to interfere with the practice of medicine.
Yeah.
I will add just briefly, I think you're absolutely correct. It's going to be driven by the budget process, but in an ideal world, it would be 10 years, which would get it in the middle of, or sort of beyond a presidential election, beyond a user fee reauthorization. So it would be a really good time, and it would give it enough time, because I believe PCORI needs to be bold, and it needs to do things a little differently. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I think it did what it needed to do in its infancy, but now it's time to pivot. But unfortunately, I don't think that'll be the driver. And like any entity that's reauthorized, it can get caught up in politics as a result.
Yeah. Mark's exactly right. The longer, the better, in the sense of avoiding all of those periods of time that are challenging. And for the program, essentially, to be able to plan out for a period of time. I mean, NIH doesn't worry about whether it's going to get money every year or be canceled. So, I mean, the ability to plan ahead, to essentially invest in long-term planning, I think is critical.
Yeah. You all mentioned politics. We've talked a little bit about changing communities, populations, and a host of other things that can affect healthcare systems and things like that. What are we doing to bring new voices to the table when it comes to coming up with new policies and innovations? Are we doing a good job? Does more need to be done?
It's a mixed bag for those of us who live in Washington. You know, I think Mark's point about the role of the patient is an enormously important one, and we have seen a tremendous growth in fact, that engagement around specific conditions as well as in the broader context of what's taking place. And I would also note that the states have really become laboratories. The states have really used the opportunity. I had an opportunity to talk a little bit about what's taking place in Georgia and the relationship between companies and the relationship around investing in research and looking at opportunities to collaborate among different programs, whether it's Georgia and Duke or whomever it might be in terms of looking beyond, or Sinai in this case. But I think we have the traditional providers of information, the universities, research community, but I do think the consumers have made a big difference. And then you have the traditional industry issues. You have lots of different constituencies. There's no shortage of folks who come to town. But I do think that consumers really have a foothold now.
The one piece I would add is we're not doing a very good job of being representative of the populations in this country. And we've not done a good job of outreach. And for the first time in a long time, in my view, we're beginning to look at how we do better in clinical trial recruitment, how we do better in really understanding subpopulations within a population. But we're just beginning to scratch the surface. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And when it comes to what you're working on, your medicines don't work equally across populations, both from ethnicity, I'm having a hard time saying that word, but also from the social and economic determinants of health. And we are not long from a period of time when the plans are going to expect that you come to them with more than just this medicine is effective in 60% of the population. They're going to know for which 60%, under what circumstances. That's going to be a very different use of real-world data and evidence, and it's going to require some modeling that we're now beginning to be able to do. But there's going to be very different expectations on you in the future that you can get at subpopulations effectively.
We have, there was a period of time, which I'm sure Mark will remember as well, when essentially the bulk of the research with respect to breast cancer was done on men, not women. When in fact, as a population, gender was a huge issue, and certainly racial diversity is a huge issue. And to Mark's point, there is truly an interest in understanding the impact on different populations, characteristics of that population, and the unique presentation of the condition and their environmental issues. Certainly questions with respect to the social determinants of care. Again, interestingly enough, the administration in this last week has indicated an interest in beginning to gather data with respect to the social determinants of care. Having worked for Bob Dole for 20 years, I was born and raised in San Francisco, so rural to me was Oakland. I had sort of no context until I got to Russell, Kansas. But there are real issues geographically in terms of access to services. The availability now of telemedicine, the ability for remote monitoring has made an enormous impact. But there's clearly a desire to understand. If someone is a diabetic and has no ability to essentially refrigerate their insulin, what do you do? If someone essentially has no access to a pharmacy or something within reach and doesn't have that kind of coverage, what do you do in terms of adherence? So lots of issues to understand, whether it's transportation, whether it's housing, whether it's nutrition. If you don't eat, essentially the impact on all of the other circumstances are unique for you. So again, I think Mark's exactly right. Those issues are becoming more prevalent in terms of our conversations about how people access care, how people utilize services, what they understand, and are we in fact uniquely sensitive to the circumstances in which they live?
And I want to build on that point because, being here in Metro Atlanta, access is not an issue at all. But like you said,
well,
if you drive,
it might be.
It could be. You're right.
You can't assume that it's not.
That's true. You're right.
You can't assume that. And that's one of our mistakes is we assume if you live in an urban area, you're fine. Now, admittedly, rural areas and frontier areas are a whole different issue. But even in urban areas, there are unique challenges in terms of access for certain communities.
How do we've talked a little, you mentioned telemedicine, and we're in an environment where we're talking about technology and innovation, but that may not even be an answer. And you're right, whether you're in an urban area, you may not have access to a computer or what have you. And if you're in rural Georgia, we're talking about building broadband.
Right, 5G.
There, 5G, but we're not there yet. So are there answers and solutions in the interim?
There's
No, go ahead.
For improving access. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to share a story of a woman in Baltimore. So an area where there's academic medical center and good medical care. She is on Medicaid and has diabetes. And for her to get to this famous academic medical center, she has to take 3 buses. And her diabetes causes her to have to go to the bathroom about once every 70 minutes. So not only is she taking 3 buses, halfway through each bus, she has to get off the bus, find a place to go to the restroom, get back on the bus. It's about a 12-hour ordeal for her to get to her appointment. My point being that we in Washington sometimes think we know your problem and we will solve it for you. When it comes to a lot of these social economic determinants, we have to go to the community and have them define for us what the problem is. And you're starting to see in Medicare Advantage, Managed Medicaid, even the large plans, investment in transportation, in housing, even pantries where you get your care so that you get food. It's a real challenge, but you also have to think of what does that mean for the dynamic of the medicines and devices you're developing, and how are they going to get deployed? Because the payers are focused on this. United Health spent over $400 million in housing alone. These are huge issues. When you look at public housing, across the country, we privatized those centers. And in many cases, that's been a good thing. But to cut costs, most of them got rid of the vans that they used to have to get people to the community. And so now they can't get to their doctor's appointments. We have to start thinking about what are the problems there, how do we solve them? And this is at a collective level, but you also have to recognize this is the future of health. And you can't assume your medicines are going to be distributed on a population level. You need to figure out how your medicines are going to be distributed at a subpopulation level within these communities across the country.
We've also seen an extraordinary reduction in the number of rural hospitals in the last few years. And I know in Georgia this has been an issue. It's been an issue in Kansas and in Missouri and in other states. And so even the provider environment has changed radically, and rethinking what that environment looks like, what the new delivery systems might look like, whether it's the use of nurse practitioners or community health workers, the presence of a community health center. But we can't assume that the old rural hospital, I mean, in Kansas at one point, 50% of the hospitals had fewer than 50 beds, and their average occupancy was about 4. Now, you can't over time survive in that kind of an environment. So the question becomes, what is it that those communities need? And so part of this conversation about looking forward is to look at what kinds of a delivery system do we need in those communities or in an inner city? And what kind of providers do we need to consider? Is it the traditional physician control, or is it more of a team environment where essentially you have a multiplicity of providers with different backgrounds but able to provide those services? So all of those things are part of this question about going forward. What does it need to look like? How do you distribute essentially medications or treatments? How do you make them available? And by whom and under what circumstances?
Right. One of the issues that certainly we've seen here in Georgia, really nationwide, is the opioid epidemic. And I wanted to touch on that because it has touched a variety of industries here in Georgia and parts of the state as well. Long-term solutions with regards to solving, treating, helping people who have found themselves addicted to opioids, and it's affecting healthcare industries, the healthcare industry obviously on various fronts. What do we do about it? How do we approach it? And I'm sure from different angles.
Exactly. And again, I'm sure Mark has thought of this as well. But there are really a variety of steps. One, of course, is prescribing behavior. And the sense that, in fact, we have not adequately prepared physicians, nurses, and others with respect to pain management, and understanding that dynamic, and understanding and helping people understand, whether it's through drug registries, whether it's through limitations in terms of the size of the prescription or the frequency with which you can get it renewed. So there are behavioral issues on the part of providers. We are woefully short of services available in terms of treatment, both inpatient as well as outpatient treatment facilities for mental and behavioral health and for substance abuse, and investment in those kinds of community resources. We've got frequently, cases mentioned of, someone who should have been in treatment but couldn't get access to treatment and then essentially causing issues. So there are both treatment issues, there are practice issues in terms of behavioral issues, all of which need to be dealt with. And again, this fundamental question about pain management. And then there's always the offside, which is not the prescription, although diversion is a huge issue. Someone's given a prescription, takes it home, and essentially it ends up in the hand of a child or a grandchild or someone, essentially part of the underlying problem, but also the illicit black market, and certainly fentanyl has become an enormously challenging question. It's access through the mails and other resources. The fact that opioids are cheap, relatively cheap today, as compared to what it was. Certainly cocaine is relatively cheap. And so I think there are a variety of issues that need to be dealt with and interventions that need to be put into place.
Two thoughts I'll share, and I'll do the first one through a story. You're getting all my best stories today, so I hope you guys are okay with this.
We appreciate that.
I mentioned I was diagnosed with cancer 3 times. The second one was a bone cancer. And from the point of diagnosis to a point where I kind of woke up from that nightmare, I had 12 surgeries in 9 weeks where they had to remove bones from different parts of my body. And the most graphic was they removed part of my brow, most of my brow on the right side, my right cheekbone, my right jaw, all the teeth on the right side, my chin, and then they went about reconstructing it. And I always say I actually tried to get them to throw a facelift in, but they wouldn't do it. Any event, I survived all that, and I remember at the end of the day them saying, "Oh, you're tough, you don't need pain med." I was in a lot of pain. Not too long after, I had some minor dental surgery, and I walked out with 30 Percocets.
Wow.
My point being that for many people living with chronic conditions, pain is a real issue. And nobody takes pain medicines because they want to, because you know what? It creates constipation. It makes it hard to concentrate. It's hard to sleep, but it's also hard to stay awake. They're not great. And the reality is we haven't put the right incentives in to develop better treatments. And one of the things we spoke with HHS and the White House early on in these conversations was put more money into basic research. And we're doing that now at NIH. And I'm actually really excited about that. But we haven't fixed the tail end of that. And that is, how do we drive incentives? Because right now, they're generic. And who in this room wants to go and make the next opioid? We ought to have some incentives to drive the market to pick up on some of this research. Because we're finding now that for many people who have substance abuse, there's a genetic characteristic to that. Does that lead to an opportunity for medication that is not opioid-based, that doesn't have the same side effects, that's not addictive? So we have to think about where we put our money. And I think Sheila and I agree on this. We get what we incentivize. And I would argue right now we're not necessarily incentivizing all the right things. And we have to think more deeply about that.
With the little bit of time that we have left, I want to end with this. We're coming into the last part of the year. What are your thoughts on? Are you optimistic? Are you a little concerned? Will there be time? Is there time for bipartisanship agreement around healthcare, around drug pricing and some of the issues that we talked about? How much can we get done in the time we have left?
Go ahead. I'll follow
The
it.
silence is sort of the answer.
Deafening, yes.
I'll tell you what I'm pessimistic about, then I'll tell you what I'm optimistic about. I'm pessimistic about anything meaningful happening in a significant way that's going to get at cost from a patient perspective. And I have to chuckle when Nancy announced the
Pelosi.
Right.
You're on your first
I'm
name
sorry.
on a first
Nancy
name
Pelosi.
basis.
Speaker
Mark and
Pelosi
Nancy.
announced the impeachment inquiry. I swore I could hear this collective sigh of relief from all my industry partners in Washington, D.C., because it meant that much of the pricing efforts are probably not going to be successful. But don't think that means it's not going to go away. You have a user fee agreement. We're already starting to draft what that is. That's coming up very quickly. So there's going to be a lot of other opportunities for this to come right back at you, and I think that's a problematic issue for you and us. I think I'm optimistic about PCORI reauthorization, and I think there's an opportunity for us to really reset the dial and get it focused on value. Because at the end of the day, the only meaningful way in a country that is driven by competition in the marketplace to bring those costs down is to bring in an appropriate value framework that differentiates the low and high value and when something is in fact high value in use. And that creates an opportunity to manage costs very differently, short of price controls. I think that's an opportunity, but it's going to be challenging.
There are about 30 days left between now and the end of the congressional session, unless it's extended, so not very much time. There are a host of things in terms of the list of things that they had hoped to get done, certainly drug pricing. The one element that might contribute towards some kind of an agreement, at least around elements of it, is the cost savings. The Grassley bill has a savings of about $100 billion. We don't yet know the savings attributed to the Pelosi bill, but they may want that money hard long enough to essentially come to some closure around some elements of the drug provisions. But there are fundamentally disagreements around importation, around reference pricing, essentially European pricing models. There are fundamental disagreements over negotiation and to what extent the federal government ought to be in a negotiation about rebates. So there are some huge differences between the House and Senate, even within the bodies. Grassley was not able to get all of the Republicans to support his effort, in part because of his rebates and the inflation adjuster. So that is one bucket of things. Surprise medical bills, I think there will be a real effort to try and come to closure on that. The question will be whether or not, in fact, there is an arbitration involved, but there is a big push on both sides of the aisle and both bodies to essentially deal with that. There are things known as extenders, which come up at the end of every year that have to do with tax provisions, have to do with a number of Medicare provisions, things like PCORI, things like community health centers. Inevitably, we do this on Christmas Eve. They sort of rush to the very end and panic, and they pull together a package of things. That could still happen. Of course, the other issue is the appropriations process, and whether or not there's a resolution to try and do the bills or simply go into a continuing resolution process that takes us at the same numbers through the next year, which for NIH and others is an issue because there are increases that are proposed that may or may not happen. But there are a series of things, arguably, in the healthcare space where, in fact, some progress could be made. But to Mark's point, the attention that's being diverted to issues around impeachment, but also issues around the trade agreements, right. And whether or not essentially we're going to continue in a tariff environment or whether we're going to try and resolve the trade agreements. We haven't finished Mexico and Canada yet. Obviously, we haven't done anything with respect to China. So there are a host of issues around trade that are also essentially awaiting some decision. And then, of course, there's Syria. So within the last couple of days, that's been thrown into the mix in terms of the withdrawal of troops. So it will be a very complicated session over the next couple of months, certainly complicated by what's taking place, and deep divisions between the parties.
Wow. Well,
on that happy note.
Exactly, right? Thank you, Sheila.
You're welcome.
Well, that actually, they've got 30 days. We have run out of time, but thank you both for sharing your insights and knowledge on this topic and various topics. Can we give them a round of applause, please?
Wow, thank you. I really don't envy living in DC right now and with all the environment, everything you have going on. This was really fascinating, and I think let's give them one more round of applause. I think this is a great discussion. Thank you, Crystal, for an outstanding moderating job. I think we have a lot to take away from this, and you touched on a lot of things that we're hearing about throughout the day, the importance of the patient throughout the continuum of healthcare, which I know is a big thing for you, Mark, and how this access to care thing is really about working better together and breaking down some silos and harnessing data and in a meaningful way. But thank you guys again for being here and joining us. I do also want to thank Michelle Williams with Alston & Bird for connecting me with Sheila and her firm. We're thrilled they were able to come down. I think it was a really valuable conversation. We often get our heads down into state issues and don't dive into the weeds on the federal issues that we know are very important to our industry. So I think this is a really valuable conversation. With that, I'm going to pivot hard here. I forgot to thank one person on our team for all their work this past few months, and that is our intern, Isabel, who was key to Christina being able to pull this off. So thank you, Isabel, who's a Georgia Tech grad student for a couple more months, I think. So really appreciate your help this summer and throughout the rest of this winter and fall. And now I'm going to pivot one more time really hard. I would like to invite Shawna Curry to start making her way up here. One thing, Shawna and I had lunch a month or so ago, and she informed me of a recent announcement, and I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is to talk to each other and let each other know about all the various assets we do have in our community, like the Georgia Bioscience Training Center that Phil Gibson here runs, thanks to Quick Start, and the Georgia Advanced Manufacturing Centers, which are in the process of getting up and running across our university systems, and of course GRA. But I think Shawna has another announcement for yet another asset within our community. Yeah.
So as some of you in the audience may know, in 2015, the Wallace H. Coulter Foundation made a 5-year gift to Emory University and Georgia Institute of Technology to help address the gap that we have across the U.S. really in translating medical technologies from the academic space into the private sector. And over the last 4 years, I'm pleased to report that our family of best practices, which is centered around VC-style diligence, non-dilutive grant funding, and integrating business and operational expertise in faculty labs, has yielded tremendous results. We have funded 40 projects from the 220 that we've scouted across Emory, Georgia Tech, and now expanding into Georgia State. That's resulted in 40 awards. From those 40 projects, 20 are now in startups. We have 2 additional licenses to industry partners and 3 products on the market today. Every Coulter dollar in has been leveraged 6.8 times over by our awardees. Building on this momentum, I am thrilled to announce here today that we are transforming the Coulter program into a new next generation program called Biolocity. This multi-institutional philanthropic effort will really transform our ecosystem by expanding our impact. And I'll get to some of the ways that we're going to be doing that. First is we have been selected very recently as a BARDA Drive Accelerator Network member. What this means is that we'll be the conduit for any 21st century health security threat innovation that's being developed within the state of Georgia and the region. So come hit us up, and we'll be your link to BARDA for up to $750,000 in non-dilutive funding. We've also gained strong traction with private philanthropy. We're the translational arm of a $1.5 million gift to help commercialize real solutions to congenital heart disease. And with that, I would like to invite you all to join us in the exhibit hall, where you can listen to the speakers on the innovation stage, which we're thrilled to be co-sponsoring with our colleagues at ATDC. You can also check out some of the poster sessions, check out some of that bleeding edge research that's being done at our academic institutions, or go visit some of the exhibitor booths. Thank you very much, and thank you, Maria.